Between insanely high-quality titles like Elden Ring and Horizon Forbidden West to impactful surprises like Sifu and The Quarry, the first half of 2022 has, by my estimations anyway, been pretty bloody good. Of course, this is still the video game industry that we're talking about, and with the sheer amount of titles that have dropped over the past few months, it is unsurprising that a chunk didn't quite hit the mark. With that in mind, then, I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 most disappointing video games of 2022 so far. Number 10, LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga. There have been so many games that have had reportedly nightmarish development processes during the COVID-19 pandemic. Already difficult working conditions in some cases haven't been helped by remote working, leading to longer time spent on a project than intended, and as such it should be commended that these games were released at all, thanks to the hard work of quality developers. That said, the extra time spent getting a game over the finish line hasn't always resulted in a masterpiece. Case in point, LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga. Now, this is probably the one game on this list that's difficult to get too worked up about. And that's because the latest LEGO Star Wars is a fine game. It is okay, it is inoffensive, it is a video game. There is ambition at the heart of it. I mean, adapting 9 movies with hundreds of characters does take skill to not crumble under the pressure, and the dedication to the variety of gameplay scenarios on display is to be applauded. It's just that this should be the ultimate Star Wars package, yet it's missing the magic found in the earlier LEGO games. There's a lot to do here, sure, but little drive for players to feel motivated to engage with much of it. If it's your first LEGO game, it'll no doubt be a blast, but for longtime fans, it's just another one to add to the pile. Number 9, Shadow Warrior 3. For about 2 hours, Shadow Warrior 3 is one of the best surprises of the year. A graphically impressive, kinetic first-person shooter that'll appeal to all the Doom Eternal fans out there. This anarchic sequel is a turn-your-brain-off spectacle. Sadly, it can't quite sustain that momentum for even its paltry 5-hour runtime. The initially blistering firefights become tiresome when you realize that the whole game can be boiled down to entering similarly laid out arenas and fighting similar waves of enemies. There's some parkour platforming to connect these combat engagements, but even that is basic and gets rote after a while. Shadow Warrior 3 can be a fine time if you throw on a podcast over the top and just blast away. Hell, I definitely recommend it playing that way because while boasting some committed vocal performances, the game's attempts at humor come thick and fast and quickly become grating. But it's just a shame to see it run out of steam so early when it makes such a strong first impression. Number 8, Rainbow Six Extraction. Had Rainbow Six Extraction, a 3-player PvE spin-off from Rainbow Six Siege, released a few years ago, it probably would have received a warmer welcome. Another game on this list that was inundated with delays and even a name change, Extraction limped out the door all the way back in January. And 6 months later, it's tough to remember that it even happened. Rather than fending off terrorists, this time around players team up to take on an alien infestation that's slowly taken over the human population. Sent into the quarantine zone, players are tasked with moving through levels, using each specialist's unique skills to get out the other side in one piece. With a few friends at your side, Extraction can be fun enough. As far as PvE co-op games go, it's more polished and engaging than, say, Alien's Fireteam from 2021, but that doesn't mean it's particularly good. And after so many years in development, it makes you wonder why Ubisoft didn't just opt for a quicker turnaround to release it as an extension of Rainbow Six Siege. Number 7, Gran Turismo 7. Like many of the entries on this list, Gran Turismo 7's placement comes with a caveat. When I reviewed Sony's Premier Racer earlier this year, I praised it for its astonishing level of detail, bevy of content, and for having some of the most engaging tactile driving sim gameplay options available right now. For the first week or so, things were hunky-dory, Gran Turismo was back on top. And then those pesky microtransactions started to rear their ugly heads. While the core progression of GT7 initially rewarded you with a healthy amount of in-game currency for completing circuits, allowing you to buy new cars and upgrade the ones you already owned at a satisfying frequency, post-release updates made this process a far more annoying grind by limiting the amount racers paid out. Backlash Backlash, of course, ensued as fans were furious that they were being pushed to buying in-game currency with real-world money in order to afford the title's top-tier cars. While this kind of post-release microtransaction push is expected from the likes of Activision and EA, to see it in a Sony first-party title was a major disappointment. Number 6, Trek to Yomi. Trek to Yomi is one of the most divisive games of the year, and honestly, I'm sorry. I really wish I loved this game. The stunning black and white samurai tale is one of the most graphically impressive 2022 releases you can get, perfectly evoking the cinematic icons it takes inspiration from. Sadly, that beauty is all surface level though, as Trek to Yomi is far more fun to look at than actually play. Having the misfortune to come a few months after Sifu delivered a supremely tight and responsive take on parry-based action, Trek to Yomi's side-scrolling swordplay is lacking from the very first combat encounter. Admittedly beautifully animated, the gameplay lacks depth and satisfying feedback, quickly becoming repetitive and unengaging. Even worse, Yomi becomes a downright chore on hard mode. Instead of emphasizing the methodical and precise strikes of the katana, combat at this level is simply an unbalanced, frustrating mess. Of course, Trek to Yomi does have its merits. I mean, it's clear to see why some fans, including our own madman Scott Tailford, became enamored with its subversive plot and gorgeous presentation. It's just a shame that the gameplay throws up major roadblocks that stop you from actually appreciating these elements. Number 5, Dying Light 2. Dying Light 2 is far from a disaster. Its massive, detailed open world has been intricately crafted to complement the game's first-person parkour, the zombie combat is as satisfying as ever, and the weapon variety is genuinely impressive. However, this long overdue sequel is only intermittently fun, as the developers put so much focus on the story this time around that it interrupts the free-flowing open world anarchy. Part of the reason the game took so long to release was that the devs wanted to transform Dying Light into a fully fledged RPG, with Bethesda-style branching paths, a whole host of side missions, and so much dialogue. And that's a noble pursuit, but sadly the game doesn't have the caliber of writing to match those ambitions, with many of the characters appearing one note, the moral choices being blatantly obvious, and the central narrative devolving into bland tropes that are neither scary nor exciting. Most story missions as well pit you against human enemies rather than the Walking Dead, a mistake Colonial Marines also made, by the way. Certain mechanics are incredibly dated. I mean, Dying Light 2 has the same lockpick mechanic as Fallout 3, and graphically the game doesn't look all that enhanced. There is fun to be had there if you know where to find it, it's just buried under so much bloat that really wasn't worth the extended wait. Number 4, Ghostwire Tokyo. Ghostwire Tokyo was potentially always doomed for a life of obscurity. Initially revealed as a PS5 exclusive, its thunder was well and truly taken away when its developers were bought by Microsoft. As such, this title inevitably felt like a holdover, rather than the PS5 shifter that it could have been. Sadly, in its current state anyway, Ghostwire Tokyo probably wouldn't have been all that valuable to Sony as a killer app. Despite boasting a tantalizing setting in a ghost-ridden Tokyo, alongside some visually spectacular spellcasting FPS combat, the game's repetition, bloated runtime, and meandering story stopped it from living up to its potential. Which is a true shame, because developers Tango Gameworks were coming off one of the best horror games of the decade in The Evil Within 2. However, if you put that incredible title side by side with this middling one, you might not even realize they were made by the same people. Number 3, Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin. Even more so than usual, Square Enix has been all in on Final Fantasy recently. With Final Fantasy 16 and the second part of the 7 remake trilogy both slated for next year, Square Enix has bolstered that slate with a string of high-budget spin-offs. However, the first of note of these, Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin, didn't inspire the kind of fan response that the publisher probably wanted. Acting as something of a remixed version of the very first Final Fantasy, Stranger of Paradise pitches itself as a love letter to the entire franchise, with series-wide nods littered throughout. Sadly though, these homages just kinda make you wish for the creative ingenuity that defined those past games, which is sadly missing here. This time around, you play as Jack, a man who is definitely some guy, that's for sure, who courts a party of other powerful fighters to trawl through dungeons for higher tier loot. Those other party members can this time around be controlled by real-life players as well, with Stranger of Paradise dipping its toes into co-op antics. Developer Team Ninja does a serviceable job with the combat, mixing Final Fantasy VII's combat with the mechanics found in their own series Neo, but even that's buried under cumbersome inventory screens and bland map design. Number 2, CrossfireX. Now, there's probably more than a few people out there right now saying, Josh, CrossfireX can't be disappointing because everyone knew it was going to be a forgettable dud from the moment that it was first announced. And yes, this generic FPS did look dead on arrival from its very first trailer, but it also had one element that raised expectations quite considerably. The fact that its single-player campaign had been developed by the always reliable Remedy Entertainment. Sadly, the Max Payne and Control makers couldn't salvage this mundane and monotonous military shooter. Lacking the spark of madness that defines even the studio's weakest efforts, CrossfireX's campaign feels like a contractual obligation. One knocked out for the money so that the team had enough resources to make the stuff they actually felt passionate about, like the upcoming Alan Wake 2. Despite releasing straight to Game Pass, CrossfireX failed to find an audience, and at the time of writing is one of the most critically lambasted games of the year. But it's not quite the most lambasted game of the year. Number 1, Diablo Immortal. Okay, pop quiz. How do you take one of the most beloved franchises and make a game with it that ends up the worst rated in the history of Metacritic? Well, you stuff it full of microtransactions, of course. Blizzard's biggest embarrassment since Warcraft Reforged, which was only 2 years ago by the way, to put how useless they've become in context, Diablo Immortal, the controversial free-to-play mobile and PC spin-off of the iconic dungeon-crawling series, actually initially received a rave reviews. Critics and players responded well to the game's addictive combat and progression, with the solid graphics being the icing on the cake. For a while, it looked as though Blizzard had turned a sinking ship around. And then, after about 20 hours or so, the game started to show its true colors. Suddenly, the once enjoyable experience became a hell of nickel and diming microtransaction storefronts with apparently shockingly stingy drop rates. YouTubers then began spending thousands of dollars on the in-game store only to be rewarded with a handful of decent items thanks to the title's RNG system. Quickly, word spread that getting the top tier gear would set you back a pretty penny if you weren't prepared to grind out hundreds of hours. At the time of writing, the backlash is only continuing to grow, no doubt cementing Diablo Immortal as yet another Blizzard-released stinker. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. What did you think about these games? Like I said, just because they're disappointing doesn't mean that you can't have a lot of fun with them. Let me know how you got on and if there are any games that disappointed you this year. And while you're down there, could you please give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.